Where is everybody? I was promised 300 people. Hey? Brownies. Yeah, right. It's 4 o'clock on a Friday on a long weekend. I reckon I might have been pulling my luck. So, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. So you've got me for about 20 minutes. So let me start with something that I think is a very true statement and something to sort of soak in, if you will. Who knows who Alan Alda is? Do you remember Alan Alda? He was the guy out of MASH, right? I don't know if you followed Alan's career. He's been in a couple of movies, but Alan now is a very well-respected and very well known science communicator now. So he's a big fanatic on science and science communication specifically. One of the things that he says quite regularly, which I think resonates to anybody, really, is the art of listening, and more specifically, the fact that you're probably not listening to somebody unless you're willing to be changed by them. So just reflect on that. You're not really listening to somebody unless you're willing, you don't have to be changed by them, be willing to be changed by what they say. That resonates with me. So you've got a choice now. You can listen. You can zone out and think about the beers you're going to have after this. You can do whatever, but you're here, so you may as well. Okay? I'm going to cover 3 topics under the banner of delivering on the promise of our food. The first topic I'm going to talk about is shared prosperity, which is sort of the nation level stuff for Australia as far as food and specifically seafood. I'm going to talk about information, and then I'm going to finish with trust. So let's just paint a picture in terms of the nation, in terms of food and where seafood sits into that, right? So if you believe Mr. Joyce's, or the Honourable Mr. Joyce, at least for the time being, if you believe his numbers, right, at a macro level, we feed on average about 60 million people per annum, right, including those that live here. 60 million people per annum survive every year based on the food that we produce here in Australia, right? There's big commodity groups in that number, but 60 million. If you say, right, so what is that going to look like in 2050, maybe? Is it going to grow? Is it going to be smaller? And you say, right, let's just assume that it doubles. I don't know how it's going to double. I don't know what the composition is going to be. I don't know where seafood's going to sit in that pecking order. But you just assume we're going to double it, right? So 120 million people per annum that Australia as a nation, as a continent, that we can feed. So if you just soak in that for a bit and say, well, the demographers and the ABS and the UN all says that we're going to have in Australia about 35, 40 million people by then, right? So last assumption, assume we feed ourselves first, right? Net, by 2050, 33 years' time, we're feeding about, rounded, 90 million people. Total output beyond our border, feed ourselves first, by 2050, 90 million, all right? So at first blush, that feels like a big number. It's not. That's in a world in 2050 that people are now bouncing around between 9 and 10 billion people. It's less than 1%. And that includes the big 3, grain, beef, dairy, blah, 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 right? In that equation then is seafood, wherever that sits, right? And we all know that a big chunk, by far and away the majority of the seafood that is cultivated, produced, procured, harvested, whatever, caught, is exported. So when you put that into context, and I can tell you now the beef producers and the grain growers don't like it when I say that to them, but what that really puts into context is why you're here, especially in the seafood industry. To me, it screams 2 things and 2 questions to really, really focus on. What is it that we're choosing to produce, or in many of your cases, produce to catch or harvest or procure or cultivate? What is it? Because that's a really important decision to make. And the second one is, who is it that's going to pay me the highest price for that? When I go around the country and sometimes overseas, when I say to people, are you actually selling your product to the person willing to pay you the highest price for that? Who's that person? Who's found that mystical person, that person willing to pay the highest price for the thing that you produce? Right? Nobody. Very few people. Because there's always a barrier in the way. It could be a non-tariff trade barrier, it could be a trade barrier, it could be a tax barrier, it could be a perishable barrier that somebody from Tassie was saying before, it's a perishable good. There's always a barrier. But if you fundamentally think about the prosperity of us as a nation and you as an industry, and me as an Australian who loves Australian food, and the story that goes with it, which we'll come back to, then it should focus the mind around what you choose to produce and who you choose to sell it to, because there is a choice. And if none other than in the seafood industry, I don't know where else we'll see it, maybe in wool or some other niche product. But unless you're playing that top-end, premium, differentiated, exclusive marketing campaign, you're playing the commodity game in a world where your supply that you're trying to wedge into is a fraction of a fraction. So you talked about earlier, when at the last panel, you talked about the China market and all that. That's all fantastic. And the opportunity needs to be jumped on by us. But it's like saying, I'm going to cater for the MCG tomorrow for the grand final, and it's the CWA women that are going to cater for it from Parks. Right? The food's going to be bloody awesome, but you can't sell it to everybody. Right? Am I selling it to the boys in the concourse, or am I selling it to the corporates in the long room? And in that example, they're very different buyers. So let's come to information. So the world of information, which you've already heard a bit about earlier today and the previous days, is like it's never been before. Who remembers back in the 90s, I guess, or whenever the internet first got popularised, the concept of the information superhighway? Remember people used to call it that, which used to mean nothing to me, the World Wide Web and the information superhighway? Well, that's exactly what it is. It's not as if that highway's got less lanes now. It's got a stack load more lanes. And all it is at the end of the day is information. Now, in the context of food production, agriculture, aquaculture, viticulture, horticulture, whatever your culture, the ability to capture and carry information is like never before. Whatever your information fetish is. And as a consumer, that is a fire hydrant that you can be fed as much as you like, whatever the platform. So if you want to know stuff, you can find it out. So in the context of food production, when we talk about the power of information, and people use all different words and buzzwords, and it creates a bit of a fog in people's mind around the Internet of Things. I was with a forestry bloke the other day, and he says, oh, we're working on the Internet of the Forest. Wow. It's just information, right? The information, the Internet of the Sea, someone should coin that term, right? The sensors on everything and the whatever the technology that's coming from the Earth or the deep sea or wherever it's coming from, it's all information, right? The trick, and this is where people have made all their money, is what to do with it, right? And a way to think about that is to think about, and it sort of goes back to my very, very, very first point around being willing to be changed by what somebody says. The art of knowing information and acting on it in ways that you haven't done before begs the question around what questions do I want to ask, as opposed to what information do I have and what does that tell me? That's where the real innovation comes. So it's really hard to grab that though. There's a lot of ag tech and aqua tech and a lot of different tech companies out there that are promising a whole bunch of different things, but the real innovation is taking that data to better decisions at the end of the day. And you can wrap it up in whatever you want, but it's the ability to capture that information in the moment that's most relevant to inform a better decision today. And that decision that you probably didn't realise you could ever make. So the world of sensors, the world of information capture and carry is amazing at the moment. There's not a lot that you can't do. If you tried to imagine a very, very simple 4-step process. Fish gets caught, or a crustacean, whatever. Between that point and the point of consumption, if you just let yourself go for a few minutes and say, right, I want to list out all the information that I want to capture between there and there. The species, the DNA profile, whatever that fish ate, if I can find out. The colour of the hair of the fisherman, the type of diesel that was in the truck, the weight, how much did it lose from the moment it was caught to the moment it got into the fish, to the fish market, right? The GPS coordinates of where it was at every single moment in time, the temperature at every single moment in time, the microbes in terms of pathogens and all this sort of stuff, by the second, a millisecond. That's a long list. If you press pause, right, because that's an infinite list, technically, and say, right, does the technology exist to actually be able to capture that? Can I capture that information in the moment that it's most relevant? Most of it you probably can. It may not be economical, but you probably can, right? Third step, is so I've listed it, I've captured it. Third step, and this is the critical one that goes into trust, is it valid information? Is it the truth? Is it a ghost? Is it a substitute? Is it a counterfeit? Is it what it says it is? How do I know it is what it says it is? Right? Last step in this mythical world will be, can I send that information once it's been captured and verified and authenticated between anybody that wishes to see it between A and B? That last step, you can. The other steps, some question marks. We can always write a list. We can always put it into a safer pipe. There's some technological barriers in between. But the big thing in terms of all of that is the trust piece. So you can do all you like with funky sensors and GPS coming out your yin-yang and satellite imagery and God knows what, right? But unless you have a promise that people value, the promise of your product, and unless you can actually prove it and people are willing to pay for it, then you may as well be like at the beginning doing what all the grain producers in Australia do, or all the Hereford beef producers do in Australia, all of the dairy producers in Australia. It's a commodity. You guys have already got, the story's been written, and as Brian was saying, the brand is already known in terms of the fish market, but every other piece of seafood branding that's out there, there's a lot of work to do. But holy dooly, if you were a marketing person, if you were a design person, like we've just recruited Russell Howcroft from the Gruen, if he had the seafood industry as a market brief, wow, that's gold, right? It's a rich, fertile area to be able to tell the authenticness of the story. The problem that we have, and the problem that all of the food commodity groups in Australia have, especially, and the Kiwis have a similar problem, in other parts of the world, is that people say that their product is from here, over there, and it's not. That's our biggest issue. And in a world where we are scarce in terms of the resource that we can capture and send away, maximising the amount when we do send it away, and it's the real thing for when we sell that, maximising that is really important to us. And especially to the consumer, because the details matter. That person that's in the long room, in my MCG example, the details matter. The punters they don't care. But when you're marketing it to the person that's willing to pay you the highest price, more than the guy next to you, the details matter. So that pipe that I talked about, and feeding that pipe with all that potential information, you might say, oh, well, people don't care, they're not going to pay for it. I'm telling you, that information request is not going away. And the last piece of advice I'd give is, which I've said to the dairy sector, the beef sector, the pork sector, the poultry sector, the wheat guys, the grain guys, the cotton guys, and especially the wool guys. is that if there are any little secrets in your processes, if there are any things that may be industry norms, may be well known within the industry, within a relative small number of people, if there's anything there that when everybody knows, and there's been some famous examples in this room, when everybody knows that that's not really a good thing, now's the time to reconsider that. Because the world of information is not getting smaller. And in fact, if you're going to try and shoot the lights out and pay over here in the high-end differentiated premium end, you don't want the handbrake of those little secrets. And pretty much every food producer in Australia, every commodity group has those. Everybody. The grain guys, the wool guys, the dairy guys, pork guys, even the chicken guys, especially the cotton guys at the moment. So I'm on the panel later, so I'm more than happy to take more questions, but on that basis I might be a little bit early. Thank you very much.